All right, let's get started. So I just want to kick off this presentation by letting you know that we're happy to make this as collaborative and discussion-based as possible. So if you have specific questions, concerns, thoughts, please feel free to post them in the chat. You can use the raise hand feature and we can ask you to unmute and you can share them live, whatever's more comfortable for you. But we'd love to make this as collaborative as possible so we can truly get to each of your questions on this important topic. But without further ado, we will go ahead and kick it off. So for anybody who's not familiar with Paragus IT, we are an employee-owned managed service provider based out of both Hadley and Worcester, Massachusetts. We provide IT services to small and medium-sized businesses in Central and Western Mass. We currently serve about 130 organizations spanning a very wide range of industries and sizes. So let's take a step back and talk about why we're here, which is typically how we like to kick off all of these webinars. This session is all about how to set up SharePoint correctly and some of the tips, tricks, and ways to get the most out of your SharePoint deployment. Before we get into this topic, though, we're actually going to take a quick step in a time machine and go back to a previous webinar that we ran on SharePoint. And I want to provide that just as a little bit of a backdrop and conversation for the topic that we're going to get into today. If you did not attend that webinar and you want to learn more, you certainly can. It's on our website. You can go back to our webinar library and check it out. But it was called SharePoint Myth Busting. And in that webinar, we talked about the fact that more and more data is living in lots of different places. When we work with an organization, we may see data spread across Box, Google Drive, OneDrive, Dropbox, people's individual computers, other cloud providers, and a myriad of applications and software services. And this was true before we even started going live on AI. And now we're seeing data in all kinds of AI repositories and stored in all kinds of AI tools. As a result, it gets quite complicated. And there's a number of challenges and issues with having data in so many different places. On top of that, believe it or not, and I'm sure some of you are on this call, there are still businesses that are storing their important files, their critical shared information that they're using to run their business, or maybe even decades of historic files on traditional file servers. And these just really aren't applicable in 2026. They don't really have the same place that they once had. The technology has evolved so much in terms of the way that we can collaborate, share, use information, search, index, and importantly, leverage AI. And none of that was true with these old school kind of legacy systems. And nobody, including Microsoft, is investing in kind of bringing those latest features and enhancements to legacy technology like this. And so I'd strongly consider that if you are still using something like this, this is probably the time to think about a SharePoint migration if you haven't already had one on the plans. So what are some of the challenges we run into when people have data in lots of different places? So first, it's a security nightmare. It's really hard to secure the front door if there's a back door, a side door, a guest house, a cottage, and several other places where the information lives. Second, management is really tricky. It's really hard to do things like set policies, have compliance, do DLP or data loss prevention. It's hard to have file naming conventions and folder structures and do all the things that we would strongly recommend that you do in order to make sure that you have really good data hygiene, which is as important as ever in 2026. The next is for business continuity. It's really hard for us or anyone else to make sure that you have good backups if your data lives in 12 different places. It's just too many areas that have to be focused on, backed up, managed, and inevitably something's going to get missed. And Murphy's Law would say it's always going to be the thing that you need the most is the thing that ends up being not backed up. Also, some of these systems, especially those legacy file systems, are a disaster when it comes to collaboration and sharing. They're really built on very, very old technology, and they don't allow for multiple people to be in the same file at the same time. They don't have version control. They don't have commenting features. They really are just old school technology that can be quite limiting today. Next is data ownership and control. Sometimes you'll have employees who are using their personal G Drive or a OneDrive account that's associated with their own 365 or a Dropbox that they set up on their own. And then if that employee leaves or you need to terminate them, you may not actually have access or ownership of that data. And you can end up in a situation where some very important critical data to your organization is actually not in your possession or your control. That's a nightmare and something we would never wish upon anybody. And it's a really good reason to make sure that you have strict policies about where data lives and that you're enforcing them. And then finally, AI adoption. One thing that we've talked a little bit about in some of our AI webinars is that in 2026 and kind of for the next several years, you're going to find that data is one of your most precious commodities, especially for businesses that have been around for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. The more good data you have, the more of an asset you have on your balance sheet. It is not uncommon at all for a company going through a transaction to get an entire additional multiple on their EBITDA if they have really good, clean, structured data. Data is kind of like the new oil or the new gold. It has tremendous value. The more of it you have and the better structured it is in terms of how hygienic it is, the more valuable it is. And you're going to see businesses really starting to leverage and understand that, and it's going to give them an incredible competitive advantage. In fact, it's going to be one of the only advantages that legacy businesses have over brand new startups is at least you've got a lot of good data. However, if that data is spread over lots of different places and unmanaged and unguided, then you don't really have that advantage. So to close this out, the benefits that we talked about during that webinar were that if you use SharePoint to host your data, you have seamless Microsoft 365 integration, which is a platform that all of us, whether we want to or not, end up using almost every single day. It's built for customization and collaboration. It is really well designed for that. It has enterprise-grade security and compliance tools. You can do everything from monitoring for specific keywords, having alerts go off when certain files are accessed, all kinds of really impressive, important tools to help you make sure the data is safe and in compliance with different compliance bodies. There's really good smart data management and search that allows you to find anything, looking for not only data, but even metadata within files. It's cost effective, much more cost effective than maintaining a file server because most of us are already paying for the 365 licenses that give us access to SharePoint. So there's no additional cost to get our data in SharePoint, whereas a file server has to be maintained and updated and patched and replaced every 3 to 4 years. And then finally, it's going to be AI and automation ready. And that's going to be an important thing as I was just talking about. So that was the quick recap of our previous webinar. For today's webinar, we're going to assume that you already agree that SharePoint is the right tool for hosting your data, and we're going to move on to talking about some of the challenges and pitfalls that prevent successful adoptions, as well as talk about ways that you might be able to leverage to level up your SharePoint experience where it's at today. When it comes down to it, when people are frustrated with SharePoint, which we do hear from time to time, we often find that the frustration they're having isn't with the technical product itself, it's structural, meaning that it's how the SharePoint migration was done, how things were designed, how permissions were configured, or some other aspect of the way the SharePoint deployment occurred, not the actual system itself. And so that's what we're going to cover today. So SharePoint itself, as I just mentioned, is actually rarely the problem. And I will say rarely, not never, but rarely. Usually the platform is quite capable, flexible, and powerful. When organizations become frustrated with SharePoint, it's almost always due to how it was structured and governed, not a limitation of the technology itself. The real issues tend to be architectural decisions that compounded over time. Either too many sites were created without clear purpose, which led to fragmentation and confusion. Broken permissions were set at lower levels, which create hidden complexity that is very difficult to audit or manage. Folder sprawl introduced deep hierarchies and slow navigation, and it reduced confidence in people's be able to search for files and folders they were looking for. And perhaps most importantly, a lack of ownership and a lack of clear policy means that no one's responsible for maintaining the structure, reviewing access, or managing the lifecycle. What happens on day one matters more than most organizations realize. Early decisions about how many sites to create, how permissions are applied, and where content should live may feel minor at the time, but those decisions shape how manageable the environment feels. And in year 2 or 3, it's going to really make a difference. If structure is loose at the beginning, complexity multiplies quickly. If governance is intentional from the start, the system remains scalable and predictable. What we often see organizations make the mistake of is just trying to do a one-to-one replacement for their file system. So we've all had legacy file systems for decades, folder structures with map network drives and nested folders, sometimes 6, 8, 12, 18 folders deep. That approach worked okay in a traditional, what we call SMB file share environment. However, when you just try to take that and bring it over to SharePoint on a one-to-one basis without taking advantage of the different structure that exists within SharePoint, you're going to run into a lot of frustration. So today's focus is about making decisions that are going to scale. Our session is about not just small technical tweaks, but it's also about foundational choices that will determine the long-term health of your SharePoint implementation. SharePoint is not just simply a shared drive in the cloud. It's a collaboration platform that's built around structured content, defined permissions, and lifecycle management. When it's treated like a basic file server replacement, that's where you're going to run into the most problems. However, when it's designed as a structured collaboration system, it becomes significantly more powerful. So with that foundation in mind, let's begin, take a look at the actual design architecture. So modern SharePoint is designed around a flat architecture model rather than a deeply nested hierarchy. In older versions of SharePoint, it was common to create subsites within subsites, building complex vertical trees that were difficult to manage and even harder to untangle later. The modern approach eliminates most of that deep nesting in favor of separate, purpose-driven sites connected through what are called hubs. This flat model improves scalability, simplifies permission, and makes governance much more predictable over time. So there's 3 important components to understand. First, at the top level, you have what are called hub sites. They act as umbrella structures. They can connect related sites together, provide consistent navigation, and allow you to roll up content such as news or search across multiple departments. Then you have what are called team sites, which are built for collaboration. They support shared work among defined groups and typically connect directly to Microsoft Teams. And this is something that we'll be talking a lot about, is ensuring that you're leveraging Microsoft Teams as the front end for a lot of your SharePoint deployment and migrations. And then finally, there's something called communication sites, which are designed for broadcasting information to a broader audience. Think about like announcements, policies, company-wide updates. They're not as much about collaboration and more about just visibility and sharing data. One thing it's important to realize that not everybody does is every single time you create a new team within Microsoft Teams, you are also creating a new SharePoint site. That reinforces the idea that sites are meant for collaboration containers. They're not merely just document repositories. So a site is going to have chat and communication that happens in team. It's going to have a repository. It might also have a Microsoft Planner. It may have a OneNote. It's going to have lots of tools and resources and attributes all designed for communication, collaboration, and sharing within a container of what we call a site. But oftentimes people just think about that as a team, and that's fine as long as you realize that behind that team is a lot more than just a channel and a chat. So architecture in this model is about clarity of purpose. Each site should exist because it serves a defined audience, function, or governance need, and we'll talk more about that. When sites are created intentionally and aligned to a real business structure, the environment remains manageable. When sites are created casually or worse, redundantly, complexity increases quickly. Modern SharePoint works best when architecture reflects the way organizations actually operate. And we'll get into the weeds a little bit more on that, but it's an important balance to strike. Usually when we work on a SharePoint deployment that has not gone well, either there are too few teams and they're trying to put way too much information in too small an architecture, or there's way too many teams and it's really confusing and hard to figure out where do I go to find certain information. There's a critical balance there. And this point is that it needs to reflect the way your business operates. Within your company, you likely have teams who collaborate or work together on different types of projects or different types of initiatives. A group of people working together is likely a good example of what a team should be in Microsoft Teams. And then that team is where that group who works together on a shared set of tasks or initiatives will share communication, documents, planners, OneNotes, anything else associated with the work they're doing. And it's entirely possible that somebody could be a member of multiple teams. You may have a team just for HR. You may have a team for executive leadership. You may have a team for managing onboardings. And those could be three groups of people who are each collaborating on different types of initiatives where it may be appropriate to have three separate teams for those different focuses. And again, we'll talk more about this as we continue. So Microsoft Teams and SharePoint are deeply connected, but they serve different purposes, and understanding that distinction is critical to designing your environment correctly. Microsoft Teams is built for collaboration and conversation. It's where your most active work happens: chats, meetings, quick file sharing, and channel-based discussions. In many ways, Teams is a replacement for internal email. If your organization is still sending lots of internal emails, especially when there's attachments involved, that's a good indication that you're underutilizing Microsoft Teams. Teams is where that communication should likely be taking place, not through email. Every time you create a new team, as we talked about earlier, Microsoft is then going to create a SharePoint site behind the scenes that will allow you to store and share files associated with that team that you've created. So that means that when you're storing files in Teams, even when you're uploading an attachment, the data itself does not live in Microsoft Teams. The data is going to live in SharePoint. And for those of you who this is an entirely new concept for, let me just quickly show you what I mean before we continue so that you can get a bit of a visual. So if I was to go to a team here, each team underneath this has a channel. Every channel is going to have this tab that says shared. That shared channel is accessing a document repository for that SharePoint site that sits behind the team. But even if I am just sharing files in chat, even images, videos, Word documents, Excel documents, all of that data is actually being stored in a SharePoint repository. And one of the ways that you can see that is when you're in a team, you can click this option to access the SharePoint site that's sitting behind your team. So if I'm in this team here called All Partners and I'm on this channel called General, I can go to Open SharePoint Library. And now I'm going to see the file structure that is sitting behind my Microsoft team. There's a folder for each channel in my team. And in each of those folders, I can see any files that have been uploaded to that channel. So in this case, I've got a lot of just pictures and videos and kind of fun things that have been uploaded in the chat, but they're being stored in this document repository that is a SharePoint site. But in that SharePoint site, you can see there's also things like tasks. You've got a calendar. You have a notebook, which is OneNote. You have things called pages, site contents. You can have calendars, like we have one called Paragus Holidays, which is a calendar. So there's a lot more to a Microsoft team than just what you're seeing in Teams. There's a lot sitting behind that. And that's an important piece to understand about how your Microsoft SharePoint deployment is going to work. So SharePoint, on the other hand, is really structured for content management. It's built for long-term document storage, permissions, governance, and compliance, as well as holding institutional knowledge. While Teams is optimized for day-to-day interaction, SharePoint is optimized for organization and control. A SharePoint site can exist without a team, but a team cannot exist without a SharePoint site in the background. This distinction matters for offboarding, compliance, retention, and e-discovery. If critical documents live inside a chat or a thread, and it's a temporary team that's created for short-term collaboration, you introduce the risk of either data loss or data duplication. If someone deletes a team and its connected SharePoint site will therefore be deleted. which can remove structured content unintentionally. So the architectural takeaway here is simple. Use Teams for active collaboration and conversation, and use SharePoint for structured governance and long-term content. When you blur the lines there between the collaboration space and the long-term storage space, that's when you can run into governance issues and data loss issues. So before creating a SharePoint site, there should be some intentional architectural thinking, not just a quick click create site. A new site is not just a workspace, it's a governance decision. So every site you create introduces permissions, ownership, lifecycle expectations, search indexing, and long-term maintenance responsibility. That means that it's important to pause and answer a few structural questions first. Who is the audience? Is this for a defined department, maybe a cross-functional group, or is this a temporary project team? If the audience is the same as an existing site that already exists, do you actually need a brand new site if it's going to be the same group of people who are collaborating? Is the initiative ongoing or is it temporary? If it's a short-term effort with the same group of people, sometimes just adding a new channel to an existing team or a library inside of an existing structure is a better choice. Another question is, does it require different permissions? If the permission model is identical to an existing team or department, meaning the same people have the same level of access, then creating a new site just fragments content and increases complexity. And finally, does it need its own lifecycle? Meaning, will this content need its own retention rules, archival process, or compliance oversight? If the answer to any of these questions is unclear, that's a signal to maybe pause and make sure that you understand a little bit more about what you're doing before you spin up that new site or create that new team, which in fact creates a new site. Let me give you a real-world example to illustrate this. Let's say you've got a 60-person company who has organically created 147 Microsoft Teams over time. Most of them were created for short-term initiatives, internal conversations, or one-off projects. There was no site naming convention, no ownership assignment, and no lifecycle policy. The result is probably predictable. No clear governance model, duplicate files across multiple teams, inconsistent permissions, and constant confusion about where documents live. Employees regularly recreate the same files because they can't find the latest version. IT has no way to audit permissions or clean up old content. So after we step back and consolidate the architecture, we can reduce the environment to probably like 8 department-based SharePoint sites and maybe 12 intentionally structured teams aligned to the ongoing collaboration needs. Each site would have a defined owner, permissions would be role-based instead of individual-based, and lifecycle expectations would be documented. As a result, you now have a significant reduction in the number of sites that you're trying to manage. It's easy to find information. You're going to save time and money, and it's going to be much easier to do things like implementing AI because we know where the data lives and we can have rich data content that we can leverage. So here's what you don't want to create a SharePoint site for, just because something feels new. Site creation should be reserved for situations that truly require structural separation, not convenience. You should not create a site for short-term projects that will dissolve in a few months. Temporary initiatives often just don't justify permanent architecture. When the same group of people already have access to an existing file and the permissions don't need to change, creating another site just simply fragments content and increases confusion. A new site is also not appropriate for what is essentially a subfolder level need. If the purpose can be solved with better organization inside an existing structure, that's always the better architectural decision. Every unnecessary site is going to add navigation complexity, permission overhead, search fragmentation, and long-term maintenance responsibilities. So instead of defaulting to creating a new site, consider lighter structural tools. A new document library inside of an existing site can provide separation without multiplying governance. A new channel within an existing team can support focused collaboration without creating another backend SharePoint site. And metadata tagging can create visibility and filtering without adding hierarchy. These options maintain architectural simplicity while still solving your business's need. Sprawl doesn't happen all at once. It accumulates through small, seemingly harmless decisions, and sprawl always leads to complexity. More sites to manage, more permissions to audit, and more duplicate content, which means more user confusion, more frustration, and more hesitancy to use SharePoint in the future. Discipline, resilient, and site creation is one of the most powerful ways to keep a SharePoint healthy over time. So let's look at the three-layer structure that works for most small businesses. For most small businesses, complexity is not the goal, clarity is. A simple three-layer structure tends to work best because it mirrors how the organization actually functions without over-engineering the architecture. At the top level, you have what's called an organizational hub. This is where company-wide content lives: policies, procedures, announcements, internal news, and shared resources that apply across departments. The hub acts as a navigational anchor and provides consistency. It's not a dumping ground, it's a curated layer for institutional information that everyone needs access to. You want to be very thoughtful about who has access to add content to that hub and who's in charge of maintaining it and keeping it fresh. The second layer consists of departmental sites. This is where the real structural separation happens. HR, finance, operations, sales, each department should have its own site because they have distinct audiences, distinct permission requirements, and distinct content life cycles. Department sites create natural governance boundaries. HR content should not be governed by the same way as marketing assets are. Finance documentation often carries different compliance requirements than operational documentation. By separating at a departmental level, you can align your architecture with accountability. Each department site should have a defined owner who's responsible for that structure, permissions, and lifecycle hygiene. And what's nice is that owner can add members, remove members, and do a lot of the administration of that site without having to contact IT. The third layer is where most of the real organization happens: document libraries structured by function within each departmental site. Instead of creating new sites for every initiative, departments use structured libraries to separate content logically. For example, contracts, employee records, scopes of service, vendor documentation, or sales collateral. Libraries allow you to apply metadata, versioning, retention policies, and automation without multiplying the number of sites that you're managing. This keeps the architecture flat but structured. This model works well because it establishes clear ownership at the department level, clear permission boundaries aligned to job roles, and a clear search structure that supports findability. When users understand where content logically belongs, confidence in search improves. When architecture mirrors organizational structure, cognitive load decreases. Overly complex site hierarchies, deeply nested structures, and excessive teams create mental friction. So please stop trusting the system and start working around, or people will stop trusting the system and start working around it. Simplicity, when designed intentionally, scales better than complexity. A clean hub, well-defined departmental sites, and structured libraries provide enough structure to govern effectively without overwhelming users. So now let's take a look at the decision matrix. Storage decisions should follow the life cycle of the document, not just convenience in the moment. Many organizations struggle with duplication because they don't think about where a file should live at each stage of its life. Instead, documents get created wherever someone happens to be working when they create them, and sometimes they stay there permanently. Other times they get moved and dragged around in lots of different places, often with multiple copies being created along the way. A much better approach is what we call life cycle thinking. In the first scenario, you're drafting a proposal alone. This is a personal, in-progress work. The appropriate place for that is OneDrive. OneDrive is designed for individual productivity and early stage drafting. It allows you to work privately, iterate freely, and decide when the content is ready for collaboration. Not every document needs to start in a team or departmental site. Early drafts often belong in a personal space. In the second scenario, you begin collaborating with 3 team members. Now the document has moved beyond personal work and it's into a shared effort. At this stage, Microsoft Teams is appropriate because it supports that active collaboration. You can co-author, comment, meet, and iterate together. The file is stored in the connected SharePoint site behind the team, but the collaboration layer is happening in Teams. This stage is dynamic and conversational. In this scenario, the proposal is finalized and becomes an official sales asset. Now it's no longer just a working document, it's institutional knowledge. This is where it should move into a structured SharePoint departmental site, specifically into a designated library for approved proposals or sales collateral. This ensures consistent permissions, version control, search visibility, and long-term governance. It also prevents multiple final versions from floating around in different teams, in different mailboxes, and in different OneDrives. This progression reflects lifecycle thinking: draft, collaborate, publish, archive. Drafting happens in our personal space, collaboration happens in a team workspace, publishing happens in the structured document library, and archiving happens based on whatever retention policies we have set for that library. Most organizations skip this intentional movement, and therefore files remain in OneDrive after collaboration, teams become a permanent storage instead of active workspaces, and final versions live in multiple places. This is where duplication will happen. So without lifecycle discipline, every stage overlaps and users begin recreating documents because they can't confidently identify the authoritative version. So through thoughtful lifecycle placement, you can reduce duplication, improve search reliability, and strengthen governance over time. Now what I want to look at are what we call some anti-patterns. Anti-patterns are extremely common, and none of them usually start with bad intentions. They start with convenience, but over time, convenience without structure creates risk. The first anti-pattern is HR storing employee records in a manager's OneDrive. OneDrive is designed for personal productivity, not institutional record keeping. When sensitive HR documents live in an individual's personal storage, they're tied to that person's employment status. If that manager leaves, access becomes really complicated. If permissions weren't properly managed, and other individuals may end up having inappropriate access to that data. From a client's perspective, this creates a serious exposure risk. Employee records require a controlled set of permissions, really good retention policies, and centralized ownership, all of which are going to be much better handled in a structured SharePoint departmental site. The second anti-pattern is contracts living inside Teams chat threads. Teams chat is designed for conversation, not long-term content management. When files are stored in chat, they're often difficult to rediscover later. They're disconnected from structured libraries, and they're not governed by consistent retention rules. Contracts should live in a clearly defined SharePoint library with controlled permissions, version history, and lifecycle policies. Leaving them in chat creates fragmentation and makes audit readiness far more difficult. The third anti-pattern is creating new teams for every initiative. It may feel harmless in the moment, especially when collaboration is active, but each team creates an underlying SharePoint site, as we've been talking about, which means over time, you're going to multiply the number of sites that you have, which fragments content and makes governance exponentially more complex. Teams created for short-term projects often remain long after the initiative ends, cluttering navigation and duplicating content across environments. Or they're deleted, in which case important information may get deleted along with them. The fourth anti-pattern is having no archival policy. Without defined retention and archival standards, content accumulates indefinitely. Libraries go cluttered, outdated files remain searchable, and users lose confidence in what is current. When there's no lifecycle management, the environment slowly fills with digital noise. Each of these patterns is going to lead to three consistent outcomes: risk, duplication, and governance headaches. Risk increases because permissions are complex and compliance boundaries become unclear. Duplication increases because users can't confidently find the authoritative version, and governance headaches increase because IT and leadership cannot easily audit access, enforce retention, or clean up the environment. None of these problems are technical failures. They're architectural and governance gaps that compound over time when your structure is not intentional. SharePoint rarely fails overnight. It generally breaks down gradually, and the decline almost always follows a predictable pattern. In the beginning, everything feels clean and organized. A company migrates from a file server or sets up new teams and sites with good intentions. The structure and naming make sense, and the permissions are simple. In the first year, it works well because the environment is small and manageable. In year 2, ad hoc decisions start creeping in. Someone needs quick access to a folder, so inheritance gets broken. Just this once. A new team gets created for a short-term initiative and never gets cleaned up. Files start living in both OneDrive and SharePoint because no one has defined lifecycle rules. By year 3, duplication increases, multiple versions of the same document exist across different teams, and departments create new sites because it feels easier than organizing the existing ones. As a result, permissions are going to become layered and inconsistent, and no one is entirely sure who has access to what. By year 4, folder sprawl sets in. Libraries are deeply nested, search becomes less effective because content is duplicated and poorly tagged. Employees begin storing important documents locally or in personal OneDrive accounts because they've lost confidence in the structure. That's when shadow IT begins to grow. By year 5, leadership may conclude that SharePoint doesn't work, when the reality is the platform hasn't failed, governance and discipline have. The system decays not because of technical limitations, but because of unmanaged growth, inconsistent permissions, and a lack of ownership. SharePoint breaks down when the structure isn't maintained, when a lifecycle isn't defined, or when no one's accountable for long-term architecture. The takeaway is that SharePoint doesn't stay healthy on its own. Without intentional governance, consolidation, and periodic cleanup, you're going to end up with a mess. One of the key things we like to focus on is SharePoint permissions. SharePoint permissions are designed to flow downward in a structured hierarchy: site, library, folder, file. By default, permissions inherit from the top all the way down. This inheritance model is intentional because it keeps access simple, predictable, and auditable. When permissions are set at the site level, everything underneath that structure will follow. However, when you deliberately break it, that's when problems ensue. The problems begin because inheritance is broken too often. Breaking inheritance may feel harmless in the moment. Someone needs access to just one folder. Another person needs temporary visibility into a specific file. It seems efficient to just adjust that one location and move on. But every time inheritance is broken, you create a unique permission set. Unique permission sets multiply complexity. They create exceptions that are harder to track, harder to audit, and harder to clean up later. Over time, these small exceptions compound into an environment that no one understands. In one case, a company had a relatively simple structure: one primary site with 12 libraries. On the surface, that sounds manageable. However, because the inheritance had been broken repeatedly over several years, the governance environment contained 437 unique permission sets. That meant access was no longer centralized or predictable. IT could not easily answer the question, who has access to this content? Auditing became time-confusing and unreliable. When employees left the organization, removing access did not guarantee full removal because permissions were scattered at lower levels. The lesson here is not that you should never break inheritance, but that it should be exceptionally rare and very intentional. The best practice is to set permissions at the site level, align them to role-based groups rather than individuals, and then stick to them. Libraries can occasionally have distinct permissions if there's a strong governance reason. Let's say, for example, within your executive leadership team, you have an HR library that only HR staff can access. That is manageable, that's easy to audit. However, when you start breaking it at the folder or even the file level, which is the worst possible level, permission changes should be avoided, except in the most exceptional cases. The higher you can set your permissions in the hierarchy, the simpler your environment remains. The lower you go, the more complexity that you're introducing. So keeping permissions as high as role-based as possible provides clarity, accountability, and long-term manageability. One of the most common permission mistakes organization makes is granting access to individuals instead of roles. It often starts innocently. Someone says, Mary needs access to this folder, or add John and Alex to this library. Over time, however, this is going to create a patchwork of direct user permissions scattered throughout sites and libraries. It becomes much more difficult to see who has access and why. So when people change roles or leave the organizations, permissions are going to be forgotten or only partially removed. A much more scalable approach to align permissions is to align them to job roles rather than individuals. So instead of adding specific names, you create structured groups such as HR editors or HR readers or finance contributors. These groups represent responsibilities within the organization, not specific people. Individuals are then added or removed from the groups as their roles change. The site or library permissions remain stable, while group membership can adjust as needed. And you can even go a step further and use what are called dynamic rules, where you can say if a employee has this job title, automatically add them to these groups. And then that way, all you have to do is maintain job titles and everything else just works seamlessly behind the scenes. If somebody gets a promotion and changes a job title, they'll automatically be added to new groups and their teams and SharePoint sites will suddenly show up and they'll have access to them. Similarly, if they change departments and get a new job title, all those teams will disappear and just the teams they need access to will show up. This approach simplifies onboarding because new employees are added to the predefined role-based groups rather than manually assign permissions across multiple locations. It simplifies offboarding because removing someone from the organization or from a role automatically removes their access through the group memberships. It also simplifies audits because you can clearly see what groups have access to what level and what level of access they hold instead of reviewing dozens of individual exceptions. Role-based permissions create consistency and predictability. They reduce the risk of lingering access and eliminate the need for constant permissions adjustments at lower levels. When permissions reflect organizational roles instead of individual names, governance will become a lot more structured rather than reactive. External sharing is one of the most powerful features in 365, but it's also one of the most overlooked risk areas if not intentionally governed. Before enabling or expanding external sharing, there's a few foundational questions that your organization should answer. Who is going to be allowed to share things externally? Is sharing going to be open to all users, limited to specific departments, or restricted to site owners only? Without clarity on this, external access can become inconsistent and very difficult to monitor. The second question is whether shared links should expire. Permanent access links may feel convenient, but they create long-term exposure if not revisited. Expiration policies create natural checkpoints and reduce the likelihood of forgotten access lingering for many years. Similarly, should downloads be allowed when sharing externally? In some cases, view-only access is appropriate. In other cases, edit permissions or download permissions may be necessary. The key is that these decisions should be deliberate, not accidental or just using defaults. Without defined guardrails, shadow IT inevitably grows. If users find external sharing too restrictive or confusing, they're going to look for alternative tools, personal cloud accounts, file transfer services, or unofficial collaboration platforms. That creates fragmentation and compliance risks that are outside of your controlled environment. So permissions are not just about convenience or access control, they're also about compliance architecture. They determine who can see sensitive data, how long access is going to persist, and whether the organization can confidently respond to audit requests, legal holds, or regulatory inquiries. External sharing, when governed intentionally, supports collaboration and client engagement. When unmanaged, it introduces the risk that often goes unnoticed until it becomes a problem. And I'll give you an example. Within our organization, because we handle so much sensitive data and have to comply with so many different compliance organizations, we have made the decision to turn off external file sharing on all OneDrive accounts and on every single SharePoint site and library except for one. We have one single SharePoint library where external sharing is allowed. If an employee needs to share data with somebody externally, they store that data in that library, often in a read-only fashion, and create a temporary short-term link that usually lasts for 90 days. At the end of 90 days, that link expires, the content is archived, and we reduce the risk of data floating around. We also know exactly what data can be accessed externally. We only ever have to audit that one library. So if we want to know what data is accessible outside of our organization, we look in one place, we do one audit, and we can see that in one clear spot. It makes it much easier. Now, that may not work for every organization. What's important is to figure out the policies that work for your organization and implement them deliberately. The next thing we're talking about is folder-only libraries. Folders organize content in a linear, hierarchical way. They force you to choose one path for a document to live in, and that path defines how you find it later. For example, if you structure contracts 2026 client status, you are locking that document into a single navigational route. If someone wants to view all contracts by client instead of by year, or all contracts by status instead of folder, the structure works against them. Folders can work at a shallow level, but as complexity increases, they create deep nesting, duplication, and slower navigation. Metadata changes that model entirely. Instead of forcing a document into a single folder path, what you can do is assign attributes to it. So rather than burying a file under contracts 2026 client status, you can create columns such as client, year, status, and department. The document lives in one flat library, but it can be filtered and viewed dynamically based on the attributes of the file. In one view, you could see all 2026 contracts. In another, all contracts for a specific client. In another, all contracts currently in draft status. You're no longer navigating through file structures, you're just querying it. This is one of the big structural differences between a traditional file structure, an SMB with map drives and lots of folders, and using the newer, more modern tools that are available to you in SharePoint. This is why metadata is so powerful. It's going to improve search because search engines can index and prioritize those structured fields. It enables automation because workflows can trigger based on the column values like status or department. And it is going to improve your AI results because tools like Copilot rely on that structured data being well organized and to surface against accurate insights. Metadata transforms a document library from just a digital filing cabinet into a structured content system. Instead of thinking in terms of where a document is stored, you start thinking in terms of what the document is, and that shift dramatically improves scalability, visibility, and governance. This is probably one of the most underutilized features of SharePoint, especially in small businesses, where it's just not something that is commonly done. The next one we're going to talk about is what are called smart libraries. A smart library begins with intentional design, not just uploading files into a folder. Take contracts library as an example. Instead of organizing contracts purely by nested folders, we're going to define structured columns that describe what each document represents. Columns could be contract type, department status, renewal date. All of these are going to allow the library to function as a system rather than just a storage bin. Contract types might distinguish between vendor agreements, client agreements, NDAs, or employment contracts. Department identifies ownership and accountability. Status indicates whether it is in draft, under review, executed, or expired. Renewal date is going to enable proactive tracking rather than reactive scrambling. Once the structure is defined, you enable key governance features that elevate the library from storage to management. Versioning ensures that edits are tracked and previous versions can be restored if needed. Approval workflows formalize the review process so that contracts are not finalized without proper oversight. A retention policy ensures that contracts are archived or disposed of according to organizational or regulatory requirements. These features are going to add accountability and lifecycle control, ultimately making your life easier. When you combine structured metadata with governance settings like versioning, approvals, and retention, the library stops functioning just like that digital filing cabinet. It becomes a structured content system. Documents are not just stored, they're categorized, tracked, governed, and maintained over time. This approach reduces duplication, is going to improve your search reliability, strengthen compliance, and create visibility into the status of critical business documents. A well-defined library reflects business processes, not just storage needs. Next, we're going to talk briefly about Power Automate. And we have done entire webinars on Power Automate. We may do additional webinars in the future, but just to touch on it briefly for now. Automation should be applied where consistency and accountability matter most. Power Automate is not about replacing people. It's about standardizing repeatable processes that are currently handheld manually and inconsistently. Approval routing is one of the most common and impactful use cases. Instead of emailing documents back and forth or relying on someone to remember to review a file, automation can ensure that when a document reaches a certain stage, such as ready for approval, it is automatically routed to the appropriate reviewer. This reduces delays and eliminates ambiguity around who is responsible for the next step. File notifications are another simple but powerful use case. When new documents are uploaded to a critical library, such as contracts or policies, stakeholders can automatically be alerted. Rather than relying on someone to manually notify them, automation ensures visibility without additional effort. Status tracking is equally important. When documents move from draft to approved to executed, automated updates can trigger notifications, update fields, and move documents into specific folders and libraries. This reduces the risk of outdated documents remaining active or approvals being skipped. Compliance logging is where automation becomes especially valuable. Automated workflows can record when documents were reviewed, approved, modified, or archived. This creates a documented audit trail without requiring manual record keeping. From a return on investment perspective, automation reduces manual error by removing reliance on memory and informal communication. It standardizes processes so they occur the same way every single time. And it also significantly improves audit readiness because approvals, version changes, and retention actions are documented automatically. Instead of scrambling to reconstruct the history during an audit, the system already contains the structured records needed. Automation, when applied thoughtfully, can transform SharePoint from passive storage into an active, governed workflow system. And now we're going to level up even one more level and bring in Copilot. Microsoft Copilot does not operate in a vacuum. It relies entirely on the structure, permissions, and organization of your Microsoft 365 environment. Copilot surfaces information based on what users have access to, how content is labeled, and how well it is organized. That means its output is only as strong as the architecture underneath it. Clean permissions are essential because Copilot respects security boundaries. If permissions are overly complex, inconsistently applied, or broken at lots of lower levels, user may either see incomplete information or struggle to understand why certain information appears in the results. Clear metadata is equally important. When documents are labeled with those structured fields like status, department, document type, Copilot can interpret context more accurately and generate much more relevant summaries and insights. Organized libraries matter because AI performs better when content lives in predictable, well-designed locations rather than scattered across random teams, chats, threads, and personal OneDrives. If your structure is chaotic, AI results will be chaotic, which means duplicate documents are going to create conflicting outputs, poorly managed permissions will surface partial information, and lack of metadata is going to limit Copilot's ability to understand the document's intent. AI is not going to fix your structural problems. It actually exposes them. When your SharePoint architecture is disciplined and intentional, Copilot becomes significantly more powerful. Structured SharePoint sites lead to smarter AI because the foundation is clear, governed, and searchable. The quality of your AI output is going to be directly reflected on the quality of your information's architecture. So as we move towards closing here and open it up for questions, you don't need 40-page governance docs. What you need is naming conventions, defined site owners, quarterly permissions reviews, archive strategies. If you get this right, governance will prevent decay and keep your environment healthy. This SharePoint maturity model is one way to understand where your organization currently stands and where the logical next step forward looks like. Most companies don't jump directly to advanced governance or AI readiness. They're going to move through these predictable stages, and recognizing your current level helps you prioritize the right improvements. Level 1 is the file dump. At this stage, SharePoint functions just like cloud-based shared storage. Files are uploaded without structure, naming standards or clear ownership. Permissions are often broad or inconsistent. Search may technically work, but users don't trust it. This stage is reactive rather than intentional. Content exists, but it isn't managed. Level 2 is organized folders. Here, teams have introduced some structure. There's folder hierarchies, naming conventions that are starting to improve, and content is somewhat categorized. However, the organization is still linear and heavily dependent on navigation. Deep nesting begins to appear. Permissions may still be manually adjusted at lower levels. This stage is better than chaos, but does not scale. Level 3 is structured libraries. At this stage, departments begin separating content into purposeful libraries rather than endlessly expanding folder trees. Ownership is clear, permissions are more consistently applied at the site or library level. There's intentional structure aligned to business functions. Search improves because content has logical homes. This is where governance begins to take shape. Level 4 is where you introduce metadata and automation. Instead of relying solely on folders, organizations implement those structured columns, filtering, version control, and workflows. Documents can be categorized dynamically. Approval processes may be automated, retention policies begin to formalize lifecycle management, and the environment becomes much more intelligent, not just organized. This is where scalability significantly improves. And then level 5 is when you get to AI readiness. This is where structure, permissions, metadata, and lifecycle management are all intentional and maintained. Role-based permissions are standard, unique permission sprawl is almost never, and content is consistently labeled. Automation supports compliance because the foundation is strong. Tools like Copilot can deliver meaningful, accurate results. AI readiness is not just about turning on a feature, it's about having the disciplined information and architecture beneath it. The goal of this model is not to criticize lower levels, but to create clarity. Most organizations operate somewhere between level 2 and level 3, and advancement is going to be incremental. Each level builds on the previous one. Moving up the maturity curve is less about adding complexity and more about increasing intentionality. The higher the maturity level, the more predictable, secure, scalable, and searchable your SharePoint library is going to become. And somebody in the chat posted, this looks like it's important to have written processes and procedures. And I think that's very true. What can be very helpful is to create almost like a visual map. Here is how we're going to structure things. Here are the roles that we're going to use to access different libraries. Here is an overview of what our company naming convention is, either company-wide or by departmental library. If you build one really clear map and everybody understands it, everybody has access to it, and everybody has been trained on it, and then you limit who has access to create changes, add teams, or expand the complexity, you can really make a lot of progress on this very simply, at least getting to level 4. So what done looks like. You have clear architecture, defined ownership, role-based permissions, structured libraries, lifecycle thinking. Your automation is flowing and helping save you time, and you are able to leverage tools like Copilot to be much more efficient in your work. That's what true maturity in SharePoint would look like. So I do want to open up for questions. Before I do, I just want to quickly let you know that we do have a survey that we'd love you to take. This survey is going to help us figure out what additional webinars you'd like to see us offer later in this year. Mary has conveniently posted that in the chat for you. If you have a few moments, we'd love you to take that survey. And I also just want to quickly plug our next webinar. We're going to revisit AI, and I know we've talked about AI a lot, but a lot has changed. And the number one thing we're seeing is that organizations are thinking about AI wrong. They're treating it like a tool, and as a result, their initiatives are failing. They're not getting the ROI. They're not happy with the results. During this webinar, we're going to cover why AI strategies are not working, the difference between experimentation and execution, and what it really takes to get an AI strategy that is going to dramatically and meaningfully impact your business for many, many, many years to come. That's going to be on March 18th from 10 to 11. We'll be sending out calendar invites and reminders in just a couple of days. In the meantime, though, I would love to open it up for questions about anything that might be on your mind as it relates to SharePoint. So somebody asked, kind of, how would you move from basically level 1 to level 2 in a maturity model? There are two ways that we have done this. In some cases, what we find is what we actually need to do is kind of leave the model that exists as a legacy, start to deliberately and intentionally build the correct model in parallel next to the legacy model, and then have a structured phase where we move the data out of level 1 into the more mature model. That can sometimes be the cleanest and easiest way to get from level 2 to level 2 or level 3. However, in some cases, if the initial setup isn't too bad, it may be salvageable. There may be a way to take a look at what's there, put in some governance policies, clean some things up, and migrate from that to a more mature model without having to do a total flip. It really is going to come down to just how bad the existing site is. If it's overly simplified, it's sometimes easier to fix it there. If it's overly complex, it's usually easier to build in parallel and move out of it. So it really depends on what end of the spectrum the problem lies on. The best strategy to create governance models. So the first thing you have to do is you really need to take some time to understand what compliance requirements might exist. What data do we have to retain for a certain amount of time? For example, certain financial data needs to be retained for 7 years in conjunction with IRS guidelines and regulations. Certain medical information has to be retained for certain periods of time. Certain client information may be governed by clauses in your contracts with those clients. And sometimes the clause says you can't retain data longer than this. We want data deleted or removed. In other cases, its data has to be retained. So the very first thing to understand when it comes to governance models is understanding your data compliance requirements. Then it becomes about permissions. Which groups of units within our business share access to information? And wherever we can create those groups, those are the libraries or teams that we're going to build, which will have sites behind them. And then it's a matter from there of looking at what does our retention policies need to be? When do we want to archive data, delete data? And what is our lifecycle management? When do we want to have data living personally, in a chat, and in a permanent library? So the best way to do this is often to kind of get a bunch of people in a room, do a whiteboard session, talk this through, a little bit of homework in advance to understand governance and compliance requirements. But working collaboratively, getting different departmental leaders together can often be a really good way to agree on a governance structure that everybody feels like they're bought into because they had voice in it. And then once we've modeled that and figured out exactly what it's going to look like, then we start to build. But a lot of companies move right to build and then figure out we'll do governance later. That's the approach that's going to get you every single time. All right, I do know that we are over time. I don't see any other questions, but I will just once again reiterate, if you ever have any questions about a webinar that we've run and you want some follow-up information, please do not hesitate to reach out. I'll post my email address in the chat, but you can also access a lot of information on the Paragus website. And we look forward to answering additional questions. And if not, we'll see you on our March webinar where we're going to dive deep into AI strategy. Thank you guys all for attending and hope you have a great rest of your week.